no inuia wa paake aloha me kulei he hi alo mili mili ke alo hawe ia makupua kulei ai he pua makamai mahalo hoi ka mole o ia pua inale ona onano hoa aku uini mahuli o ke aloha kama ia ke aloha apa apono e mauana nona kaua kau kalo kanu o ka aina pili ku'u o hana pulama. Mahalo ho'i ka mole o ia pua inale iona onano hoa aku uini mahuli o ke aloha kama ia ke aloha apa apono e mauana nona kaua.
Turn back the years to 1898, the year of Remember the Maine of San Juan Hill and of rumors of a strange new contraption, a horseless carriage. In the little town of Warren, Ohio, the Opera House has announced the showing of one of these newfangled moving pictures. Two of the business leaders of Warren were the Packard brothers, J.W. Seated and W.D., successful manufacturers of electrical equipment. Now and then, through the streets of Warren, would chug one of these new gasoline buggies. On hearing that they were made in Cleveland by a man named Winton, J.W. sets out to buy one. How happily he started on that 60-mile return trip, for a few miles, that is. But oh, the inglorious arrival in Warren, when after a series of breakdowns, he was finally towed the rest of the way by a team of farm horses. For days, J.W. tinkered with the innards of that car. Out of these probings, he made a number of important discoveries and decided to go back and tell Mr. Winton, as one engineer to another, how he can improve his car. Maybe Mr. Winton's day had gotten off to a bad start. Anyway, his reaction is curt.
Listen, Packard, if you're so smart, why don't you build a better machine yourself?
This certainly wasn't the response J.W. had expected, but its results launched a new epoch in personal transportation.
Well, Mr. Winton, I think I'll do just that.
Setting aside a corner of his electrical equipment plant, Packard and a few associates started drafting their new automobile. And then November 9th, 1899, the first Packard maneuvers the streets of Warren among interested neighbors, frightened horses, and delighted small boys. It was a single cylinder with starting crank on the side, with a shovel-handled grip on the steering tiller. Friends of the Packard brothers insisted that they build machines for them, too. So almost before they knew it, they found themselves building automobiles under the name of the Ohio Automobile Company. Let's take a closer look at our Model A. It has 3 speeds forward and 1 reverse. It's a sharper-looking job than any machine heretofore. And here's the payoff. It sold for $1,250. In 1900, they held an automobile show in Madison Square Garden, New York. Here is the Packard exhibit. The new model had the same chassis as the 1899 number, plus a dos-a-dos seat. That means back-to-back. The backseat passengers might not know where they were going, but they could sure see where they had been. Evidently, that dos-a-dos stuff didn't go with the young bloods of that day, because the very next year, the rear seat is turned around and elevated. Note the new steering wheel, which has replaced the tiller. Packard was the first to go to a steering wheel. 5 Packards like this were entered in the great endurance race, all the way from New York to Buffalo. This is the finish line in Buffalo. Less than half of the 89 entries completed the race, but all 5 Packards finish among the leaders. Another body type this year was this touring model with the rear entrance tonneau and tete-a-tete seats. This same year, a Warren man by the name of Alden S. Murty becomes nationally famous. He is arrested for driving his Packard at the scandalous speed of 40 miles an hour. The date is now 1902. J.W. Secretary enters his office.
Here, Mr. Packard, is a letter from a man who wants information about the dependability of Packard cars.
We have no sales literature, you know that. We're all too busy to write on these details.
But what am I going to tell him? I have to tell him something.
Oh, tell him to ask the man who owns one.
Ask the man who owns one. The birth of a slogan not only destined to become one of the best known, but the most challenging slogan in all advertising. Not only to the world, but a daily challenge to us in every new Packard we build. This was the house that served as the office of the Ohio Automobile Company. But in 1903, the directors decided to move the plant to Detroit, which was even then beginning to emerge as an industrial center. Although J.W. maintained his home in Warren, as an officer of the company, he was naturally a frequent Detroit visitor. Here he is, making the trip in one of the early custom models. The name, too, was changed to the Packard Motor Car Company, and the new factory was built in open country on the outskirts of the city. This, the original office building, was completed in 1904 and was the first industrial application of poured concrete construction, a radical departure from building practices at the time, which was later to become standard throughout the industry. Now meet a couple of true pioneers, Tom Fetch, one of the Packard's test drivers, and Old Pacific. People still refuse to take automobiles seriously. Packard decides to have a man drive one from San Francisco to New York. If a car could make a trip like that, people would have to admit it was practical. This is the car and the man who starts out to do it. Well, you can imagine. Road maps were unknown, let alone road signs and route numbers. For that matter, the roads themselves, for great stretches, were practically non-existent. Fetch carried his own road or improvised it as he went along. Here he is in the midst of the Nevada desert. His road ahead is the length of canvas you see he has laid down. It took 7 days to cross the Nevada sands. Brush, small trees, fence posts, even the floorboards were pressed into service time and again to get out of the mud. But 53 days after it left San Francisco, the little old car pulled up in front of the Astor House on Broadway in New York, to be met by cheering enthusiasts in white steamers, Ramblers, Pope Toledos, and so forth. Old Pacific had done it for the industry. The automobile had proved itself. But of course, we had only started. This 1904 mud-spattered model is the first 4-cylinder Detroit-built Packard coming home via Washington Boulevard. This elaborately shrouded crew of test drivers have just completed their 4th round-trip run to Chicago and return, or as it frequently meant, 670 miles of flying mud. Let's see the car itself without all that mud. Notice the familiar Packard radiator shape and the equally distinctive hex design on the hubcaps. In those days, the factory would occasionally overhaul a Packard for its owner. It became the practice to identify such cars by adding a red center to the hexagon. For some reason, this caught the fancy of the general public, and buyers of new cars began asking that this little touch be added to their own car. Racing enthusiasts of 1904 didn't have to take the long jaunt to Indianapolis to see a good automobile race. The Grosse Pointe track was one of the best, and it was on this oval that the Packard-built Gray Wolf broke the American 1-mile speed record 13 times in 2 days. A few days later, it won the 1,000-mile nonstop run on the same track. This doesn't look like our assembly lines of today, does it? But in 1906, horsepower started with 2 congenial sawhorses. And don't laugh, they sired 250 cars that year that way. A relation of the last Packard 30 of that year, 12 days ahead of schedule. With one of their number dressed as Uncle Sam perched on the hood, the car loaded with workmen circled the plant at the noon hour. By this time, the sewing rooms were busy places. Here, standards were set which are still maintained, standards of interior comfort and luxury which are still unmatched in the industry. For the first time, fenders were recognized as an important part of the body design. The average cost of the car was now around $4,200, and production was up to 1,400 cars for the year. With all this increased activity, there was still time for fun and entertainment. The factory band of 35 pieces obliged with regular concerts during the noon hour, and also added a festive air to this all-day excursion to Bob Lowe, the forerunner of our grand company parties of today. But even in those less hectic days, transportation was a problem. The brown derbies and the open-air trolleys are unmistakable signs of the times. Getting back to the daily routine, we find the body shop busy putting out custom jobs for a trade which was rapidly growing to recognize in Packard a quality car, built for prestige and durability, and now available in 6 different body styles. By 1914, important improvements had brought along electric lamps at the side and rear, a 48-horsepower engine, and deluxe models with built-in speaking tube, buzzer, hat and parcel carrier, dome light, and toilet case. And the 1914 Packard was the first one equipped with an electric starter. And for the first time in automobile history, the handbrake was shifted to the driver's left. The Imperial Coupe for 4 passengers was another new and exclusive design. In this model, a disappearing rumble seat was offered for the first time. 1915 brought the famous Twin Six, the first 12-cylinder car to be built in America and the first car in history with aluminum pistons. 1917 brought new honors to Packard when on the tide-tapped sands of Daytona Beach, Ralph Topama drove his famous racer at the hitherto unheard-of speed of 149 miles per hour. Yes, Packard was prestige on the speedway, and on the highway, life was pleasant. And then suddenly, war. Packard pitched in with war bond rallies, with technical and manufacturing know-how. Here on the right, we see Colonel J.G. Vincent, Packard Vice President of Engineering, the co-designer of the famous Liberty motor, for which plans representing months of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars were presented to the United States government as a patriotic gift from Packard. Men left the plant by the hundreds to do their bit in this struggle, and many of them never came back. But at last it was over. Once more, America could settle down to the pursuits of peace. And at Packard was launched an expansion program with millions of dollars for new precision tools. New production methods had their effect on prices in those early post-war years. The minimum price for a Packard in 1919 was $4,800. In 1920, with reorganized manufacturing methods, it dropped to $2,975. And in 1921, it was down to $2,350. More than ever, Packard was becoming a symbol for those who desired the best. Here we see Gilda Gray, dancing star of the Ziegfeld Follies, talking to Colonel Vincent while at the factory awaiting delivery of her new Packard. On the production front, Packard continued to add to its impressive array of firsts. The 1923 model shown here was equipped with the first 4-wheel brakes to be offered on any volume-produced American car, and also the first built-in stop signal, windshield wiper, and front and rear bumpers. This was a year when best quality ham sold for 25 cents a pound and milk 10 cents a quart, when department stores advertised men's overcoats for $13.50, and when Ford Roadsters were tagged at $468 on dealers' showroom floors. This was also the year that Packard became the first car to make complete equipment standard, a merchandising bombshell in those days. And in 1925, we were reminded of Packard leadership in still other fields, when the Packard-powered Navy seaplane PN-9 spanned the 2,000 miles between the mainland and Hawaii to set a new world's distance record before being forced down with empty tanks. Still more innovations in automotive engineering were coming along rapidly. For its smaller cars, the company goes from 6 to 8 cylinders. The spark lever disappeared from the steering wheel for the first time, and mechanical snubbers gave way to hydraulic shock absorbers. In 1928, Packard products became dominant in still another field, when Miss America 7th, powered with two 1,100 horsepower Packard Marine engines, won the Harmsworth Trophy Race and established a new world speed record on water. Miss America's the 8th, 9th, and 10th, also powered by Packard, repeated this victory in 1929, 30, 31, 32, and 33. Also in 1928 was introduced shatterproof glass, another first. And that year, Packard again made engineering history when we built the first aircraft diesel engine, continuing a broad sweep of achievement in marine and air and automotive fields. With this engine in a Belanca plane, Walter Leese and Frederick Brossi promptly won the world's non-refueling aircraft flight duration record by staying aloft 84 hours and 33 minutes over Jacksonville, Florida, a record that still stands. This contribution to the advance of aeronautical science was recognized the following year when President Hoover, acting for the Aeronautical Chamber of Commerce, presented Packard's then president, Alvin Macaulay, with the Collier Trophy for Distinguished Achievement in Aircraft Engineering. In 1932 and 1933, it was the Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago. Among some of the more spectacular attractions were the Sky Ride, the streets of Paris, and the new Packard 900 over at the Motor Building. First called the Light 8, this was the first truly fine car to sell for under $2,000, and it was the sensation of the show. Completely new in appearance, but retaining the characteristic Packard lines, it had an unusually attractive V-type radiator, and the new silent gear shift was a big sales point. And here's Miss America the 10th that we told you about, equipped with 4 Packard engines, the world's fastest boat, better than 124 miles an hour, a record that stood for years. Yes, Packard was setting records on land, in the air, and on water. 1934 saw another striking new Packard with new interior refinements. There were 2 more firsts. A place was provided for a radio, and this model was also the first in the industry to use constant action windshield wipers. During all these years, many of our models were put through their paces on the Harper Avenue Proving Grounds, on which site was later to be erected the Aircraft Office Building and the Aircraft Engine Test Cells. In 1934, Packard made still another great decision. Over $6 million was spent in tooling up, and the best brains that money could buy were brought in to plan special engineering and production facilities. At last, the production was ready. The long-awaited moment was at hand. The curtain rose to reveal the Packard 120, the gem of the lower-priced field. Its sales records were phenomenal. So great was the public's faith that we had 10,000 orders before a wheel was turned. Ranging in price from $980 to $1,095, the 120 came from out of nowhere to capture 3rd place in our price class by the end of that year. 1937 also saw the width of Grand Boulevard spanned by the graceful bridge, a now familiar landmark to all Detroiters, which forged the last link in the mile-long chain of Packard factory buildings. Which way to go, boys? He went that way. No, this is not a posse, but the 1937 Packard Rifle Club lined up for their trophy picture. We honestly weren't mad at anybody. The most fight we were looking for was the noon-hour checker game. Then a big-mouthed guy in Berlin made a wrong move. Well, he made his move, and we jumped him. Out came the machines that had made automobiles. In went the machines to make the engines of war. Packard built Rolls-Royce aircraft engines and Packard Marine engines. As we took on the great Toledo plant and the Hearn and Milwaukee Avenue plants, our employment soared to more than 42,000. Weeks before WPB Chairman Donald Nelson issued his directive, Packard management and labor had already joined hands in a war production drive known as Work to Win. Some 56,000 engines rolled off our assembly lines into Lancaster and Mosquito bombers, Warhawk, Hurricane, and Mustang fighter planes. And in the water, every PT boat that roamed and fought in the 7 seas was powered by Packard. Back home, the people in the plant bought and presented to the Air Force a Packard-powered Mustang, the Packard Sky Clipper, which later made a name for itself in the skies over Europe. Then, at long last, then the sober problem of reconversion. Out comes the war machinery, back in go the automobile assembly lines. Before the roof was completed over our new main assembly, the first post-war Packard Clipper was moving down the line, an assembly line second to none in the industry for efficient layout and modern design. During the war, the Army had taken over the proving grounds for testing tanks, and it was returned to us at total loss. So, we built a new and better one. Here, special contour machinery riding its own rails forms the saucer-like banks of the curves. The new test track stands today as the fastest and finest track in the world and is valued at $2 million. Though through 1946 and 1947 we were plagued by steel shortages, strikes in suppliers' plants, and other impairments that stood in the way of our full capacity to produce, nevertheless, we had the distinction of presenting the first full line of 48 cars in the industry. Free flow styling, fresh air ventilation, a custom car with curbstone identity. And during these first post-war years, Packard began preparations for the future, which were far-reaching in implication. The size of the dealer body was increased, and dealers' investment shot up to a new high of more than $80 million. Fuller use of modern techniques of market analysis encouraged us to raise our sights and to prepare to handle an ever-increasing share of the quality market, a determination which was proved correct when production and sales for 1948 doubled those of 1947. Retooling was not confined to machines and assembly lines. New departments were formed and new personnel joined forces with us to be ready against the day when the chips were down and the challenge of free competition had to be picked up. These are some of the things that have taken up the first 50 years of the Packard story. And now, what about the next 50? Well, we've already started. With abounding faith in the future, we're on our way. We have the plants and the equipment. We have the people and the know-how. We have the spirit. Conditions are ripe for a future both glorious and secure. And you, too, are invited to have your part.